On the coast of Veracruz, a colonial church has remained in silence since 1804. Its doors have been locked with heavy chains for more than 2 centuries. The locals do not speak its name after nightfall, and since the early 1900s, children have been taught to cross the street whenever they pass in front of it. They say the last priest who served there vanished after giving a sermon that made the statue of the Virgin weep blood. What few know is that behind a shattered stained glass window hides the true reason no one has set foot inside that temple in 200 years. Today, we will uncover the secret the church authorities have tried to bury for generations. But before continuing with the story of the Church of San Joaquín of Veracruz, if you enjoy mysteries like this, don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications. Each week we bring you new tales that will leave you breathless. Now, let's return to this coastal town to discover what happened on that fateful night that changed the destiny of an entire community. At the beginning of the 19th century, the port of Veracruz flourished as one of the most important commercial enclaves of the Spanish Empire in the New World. Its cobblestone streets, always damp with the sea breeze, bustled with activity from dawn until late at night. European merchants, African slaves, wealthy Creoles, and native people mixed their tongues in a constant clamor that only ceased during Sunday Mass. The Church of San Joaquín rose majestically on a small hill on the outskirts of the port. It wasn't the largest or the most ornate in the region, but it possessed a particular beauty that made it stand out. Its light-colored stone walls contrasted with a reddish terracotta roof, and its bell tower, visible from sea, served as a beacon for sailors returning to land after months of navigation. The temple's most distinctive feature was its spectacular rose window, a circular stained glass design of vivid colors representing the martyrdom of Saint Joaquin, crafted by a Catalan artisan who tragically died on his voyage back to Spain. Father Sebastián Aguirre arrived in Veracruz in 1798, coming from Mexico City. At the age of 40, he was a man of severe appearance, yet gentle gestures, tall and thin, with pale skin unusual for those lands. Despite the suffocating coastal heat, he always wore a perfectly pressed black cassock. His deep, resonant voice captivated parishioners during Sunday sermons. He had a peculiar way of looking directly into people's eyes, as if he could see beyond their faces and into the very depths of their souls. In a short time, Father Sebastián had earned the respect of the community, not only for his dedication to religious duties, but also for his genuine interest in local traditions. Unlike other priests who had tried to eradicate indigenous customs, he would spend hours talking with native elders, learning about their remedies and beliefs. This unusual behavior earned admiration from some, but suspicion from others, especially from Governor Don Francisco de Iturbide, who regarded with mistrust any closeness to the pagan superstitions of the natives. Life in Veracruz, meanwhile, followed its calm rhythm, marked by the seasons and religious festivities. The Holy Week processions, collective baptisms, and lavish weddings of wealthy families were the highlights of the social calendar. No one could have imagined that this peaceful routine was about to shatter forever. During those days, an unusual tension hung in the air. Some attributed it to rumors of independence movements spreading from the country's interior. Others blamed the drought that had ruined the corn harvest. The most superstitious pointed to the strange reddish hue the sea had taken on for 7 consecutive days, a phenomenon the fishermen interpreted as an omen of coming misfortune. It was in this atmosphere of unease that Father Sebastián began to change. At first, it was subtle. He would forget words during Mass, spend entire nights in the bell tower staring out at the sea, and neglect the visits to the sick, a task he had once carried out with devoted care. Dona Mercedes, the elderly woman who cleaned the church, was the first to notice that something was wrong. "The Father is not the same since he received that book," she whispered to her daughter. "He keeps it locked in an iron chest and reads it by candlelight until dawn. When I go to clean his study, I find pages and pages filled with symbols that don't seem to belong to this world." The morning of May 17th, 1804, dawned unusually cold for the season. A thick fog blanketed the port, preventing ships from setting sail and giving the town a ghostly appearance. Fishermen, unable to go out to sea, gathered in the main square to share stories and a guardian to ward off the chill. It was one of them, Miguel Ordóñez, who first heard the sound. "The bells of San Joaquín are ringing on their own," he said, interrupting the chatter of his companions. Everyone fell silent to listen. Indeed, a slow and steady toll drifted from the hill, even though it was neither the hour for Mass nor the time for any special ceremony. What was most unsettling was the rhythm. 3 measured chimes followed by a long silence, then 3 more. A cadence no one had ever heard before. "It's a death knell," murmured an old woman selling tamales on the corner, "but not like the ones we know. This is an ancient call, from before the Spaniards arrived." As the morning went on, the fog did not lift. Instead, it seemed to grow denser, especially around the church. Some neighbors, curious about the continuous ringing of the bells, decided to climb the hill to investigate. Among them was Don Rodrigo Villaseñor, the town's physician and one of the few who dared to openly question ecclesiastical authority. When the group reached the square before the temple, they froze in place. The heavy wooden doors, usually secured with a simple lock, stood wide open. Yet the darkness spilling from within was so absolute, it seemed like a solid black wall. And strangely, the bells, which they had heard so clearly from town, were now silent. "Who will come with me?" asked Don Rodrigo, taking a step toward the entrance. No one answered. Turning back to glance at his companions, he noticed they were all staring at something above his head. Following their gaze, he saw what had seized their attention. The rose window, the great circular stained glass crowning the facade, was missing a fragment. It was small, barely the size of a hand, but its absence was unsettling, like an eye stripped of its pupil. Summoning his courage, Don Rodrigo crossed the threshold of the church. Inside, everything was steeped in a dim greenish glow, faintly illuminated by the fractured stained glass. The first thing to strike the senses was the smell, a mix of melted wax, stale incense, and something else. Something metallic and sweet that the physician instantly recognized as blood. "Father Sebastián," he called, but his voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself absorbed it. There was no reply. As Don Rodrigo advanced along the nave, he noticed the pews had been pushed to the sides, leaving a wide, empty space. On the floor, drawn in what seemed to be ash and dried blood, lay a complex circular symbol inscribed with characters from no known alphabet. Reaching the altar, the doctor stopped abruptly. The image of the Virgin, which usually presided there, had been turned to face the wall, and upon a marble table, where offerings were customarily placed, lay an open book. Its yellowed pages were covered with tiny, incomprehensible writing. But what truly froze Don Rodrigo's blood was what lay beside the book, a small fragment of colored glass, clearly torn from the rose window, and next to it, Father Sebastián's neatly folded black cassock. Both were stained with what looked like fresh blood. Then he heard the chant. It did not come from outside, nor from any visible corner of the church. It seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, a droning litany in a strange tongue, chanted in a voice that sounded like Father Sebastián's, yet warped, as if speaking through water or from a vast distance. Don Rodrigo recoiled instinctively, stumbling over something soft. Looking down, he saw a hand protruding from beneath the altar. His heart racing, he bent and pulled, revealing the body of Dona Mercedes, the woman who cleaned the church. Her eyes were wide open, staring into the void, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. But the most disturbing detail was the mark on her forehead, the same symbol drawn on the floor, but here it had been seared into her flesh as though by a branding iron. The physician could not bear to stay another second. He bolted toward the exit, shouting to those waiting outside to fetch the mayor and the church's representatives. As he hurried down the hill, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A tall, slender figure dressed entirely in white was watching from the hollow of the broken rose window. He could not make out its face, but he was certain of one thing. It was not human. That same afternoon, when the authorities finally dared to enter the temple, they found no trace of Father Sebastián. The symbol on the floor had vanished, as had the mysterious book. The body of Dona Mercedes remained the only tangible proof that something terrible had happened there. And so began the mystery that would forever transform the small church of San Joaquín into a cursed place, shunned by all the inhabitants of Veracruz. 50 years after Father Sebastián's disappearance, the Church of San Joaquín remained closed and abandoned. Officially, the ecclesiastical authorities claimed the temple was under repair, but no one had ever seen a single worker on the site. Heavy chains and locks secured the doors, and a wrought iron fence surrounded the entire perimeter. The town itself had changed dramatically. First came the War of Independence, then the constant internal conflicts, reducing the once thriving port to a shadow of its former self. Many wealthy families had fled to Spain or Cuba, while the colonial houses slowly decayed beneath the relentless Veracruz sun. The hill where the church once served as a place of gathering and celebration had become a desolate wasteland. Wild vegetation grew aggressively around the building, as though nature itself sought to erase its existence. Birds would not perch on its roof, and not even lizards, so common in the region, dared to venture within the fence perimeter. Stories about what happened that morning in 1804 had grown and warped over the decades. Some said Father Sebastián had made a pact with the devil to gain forbidden knowledge. Others claimed he had unearthed an indigenous idol beneath the altar, which then possessed him. The most extravagant tales spoke of a portal to another world opening through the broken rose window. Yet the theory most people accepted was far more mundane. The priest had discovered a treasure hidden in the church during the conquest and fled with it, not before murdering poor Dona Mercedes to silence her as a witness. Promoted actively by the authorities, this explanation reassured many. After all, greed was a sin people could understand, almost forgive. But a small group of elders, descendants of the natives who had once spoken with Father Sebastián, kept alive a different version. They would gather secretly on moonless nights and whisper their knowledge. The priest had been investigating ancient rituals, older even than the Aztecs, tied to entities that dwelled beyond the stars. According to them, the missing fragment of the rose window was no accident. It was part of a constellation that appeared in the sky only once every 200 years. In 1854, exactly half a century after the incident, something occurred that rekindled the mystery of San Joaquín. During a particularly violent storm, lightning struck the church's bell tower. It caused no fire nor visible damage. But the next morning, neighbors living closest to the hill swore they had heard the bells ringing throughout the night, repeating the same eerie pattern. 3 tolls, silence, 3 tolls. At that time, Gabriel Montero, grandson of Don Rodrigo Villaseñor, the doctor who had discovered Dona Mercedes' body, was now the official chronicler of Veracruz. Educated in Europe and with an analytical mind, Gabriel had grown up hearing the story firsthand from his grandfather until the day the old man died. He had always believed that behind the fantastic tales there must be a rational explanation, and he decided the time had come to investigate. With the authority of his position and a letter of recommendation from the governor, he requested access to the church's ecclesiastical archives. After weeks of persistence, he was finally allowed to review some documents relating to San Joaquín, though many appeared incomplete or had clearly been censored. Among the yellow, dusty papers, Don Gabriel found something unexpected, a report signed by a certain Father Ignacio Mendoza, sent by the Archbishop to investigate the events of 1804. Dated barely a month after Father Sebastián's disappearance, the document mentioned the existence of the priest's personal diary. It claimed the diary had been sent to Rome for review and possible destruction. Most disturbing, however, was Father Mendoza's own description of his visit to the church. Upon entering, I felt a chill that pierced to my very bones despite the suffocating heat outside. The smell that clung to the place was not that of death or decay, but something older, alien to this world. Examining the absent fragment of the stained glass, I confirmed it corresponds exactly to the constellation described in the heretical writings of the Codex Gigas. I cannot help but wonder whether its absence signifies a window or a door. The report ended abruptly, followed by a marginal note written in another hand. Father Mendoza has been relieved of his duties and transferred to the monastery of San Francisco in Spain for an indefinite spiritual retreat. This matter is hereby closed by direct order of His Eminence. Gabriel kept this information to himself. He knew making it public would only bring trouble with the church, still powerful despite the liberal reforms. Instead, he began his own private investigation, searching for any trace of the mysterious Father Ignacio Mendoza. His inquiries led him to discover that the investigator priest had never reached Spain. The ship he was traveling on, the Santa Maria de Los Angeles, had sunk in the middle of the Atlantic with no known survivors. A chilling detail, the date of the shipwreck coincided exactly with the first anniversary of Father Sebastián's disappearance. Meanwhile, the church of San Joaquín continued to deteriorate. Part of the roof had collapsed, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. Yet no one dared suggest demolition or restoration. It was as if the entire city had reached a silent agreement to simply ignore its existence and let time and nature erase it. But Gabriel could not ignore it. Each time he passed nearby, he felt the eyes of the figure in the broken rose window following him. At night, he dreamed of a chant in an unknown tongue, calling him to climb the hill. On May 17th, 1904, exactly 100 years after Father Sebastián's disappearance, Veracruz awoke with a strange, collective unease. No one could quite explain it, but since dawn, dogs had barked incessantly. Children cried for no apparent reason, and even the sea behaved strangely. Waves broke on the shore in irregular, almost rhythmic patterns. From the balcony of his home, Don Gabriel Montero, now an old man of 73, watched the horizon when he noticed the fog. Thick and unnatural, it swirled around the hill of San Joaquín, exactly as his grandfather had described a century earlier. With his heart pounding, Gabriel called for his grandson Eduardo, a young architect recently graduated from the National University. "Today is the day," he said with urgency that startled the young man. "I need you to come with me to the church." Eduardo had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about the mysterious temple, but had always dismissed them as exaggerations, the obsessions of an old man over a simple case of robbery and murder. Still, the tone of Gabriel's voice left no room for argument. As they climbed the hill, the old man explained that he had been studying celestial cycles for years, based on the notes he had found. According to his calculations, that very day, the constellation mentioned in Father Mendoza's report would appear for the first time in a century, perfectly aligned with the gap in the broken rose window. "And what do you expect to find, grandfather?" Eduardo asked, half amused and half worried for the old man's sanity. "Answers," Gabriel replied, "and nothing more." When they reached the rusted fence around the church, they discovered something unexpected. The chain securing the gate lay on the ground, cleanly cut. Someone had beaten them to it. With renewed urgency, Gabriel pushed the iron gate open, its hinges groaning mournfully. As they approached the building, the state of abandonment was obvious. Vegetation had invaded the structure, moss covered the walls, and the entire north side of the roof had collapsed. The main wooden door, however, was in perfect condition. It showed no signs of age or force, as if time itself had spared it. Trembling, Gabriel reached out a hand to push it open, but Eduardo stopped him. "Let me go first," the young man insisted, concerned about the building's safety. Upon entering, Eduardo was momentarily blinded by the contrast between the bright sunlight outside and the gloom within. When his eyes adjusted, he was astonished to see the interior was in far better condition than expected. There was dust and cobwebs, certainly, but the pews were still in place, and the altar, though stripped of its ornaments, remained intact. Gabriel walked straight to the front of the church, as if he knew exactly where he was headed. He stopped before the altar and ran his hand over the marble surface, clearing away decades of dust. "Help me move it," he asked his grandson. Puzzled, Eduardo obeyed. To his surprise, the heavy altar slid aside with ease, revealing a small trapdoor in the floor. How did you know it was here? Eduardo asked, astonished. I didn't, Gabriel admitted, but I suspected. In his report, Father Mendoza mentioned a safe repository where certain objects had been hidden, objects that could not be destroyed, but also could not fall into the wrong hands. With trembling hands, the old man lifted the trapdoor. Beneath was a small cavity, barely large enough to contain an iron box the size of a book. Gabriel pulled it out reverently and searched his pockets until he found a tiny key that hung on a chain around his neck. I found this among my grandfather's belongings after his death, he explained, inserting the key into the lock. I never knew what it was for until today. The box opened with a metallic click. Inside were several objects, a rosary of dark wooden beads, a small glass vial containing what looked like blackened soil, and most importantly, a leather-bound notebook bearing the initials "Se" on its cover. The diary of Father Sebastián, Gabriel whispered, his voice a mixture of fear and excitement. The one supposedly sent to Rome. While the old man carefully flipped through its pages, Eduardo wandered the church with an architect's eye. Something about the proportions of the space felt wrong. Shadows fell at impossible angles, and he constantly had the sensation that the walls were either farther away or closer than they appeared. Eduardo, come see this, Gabriel called, his voice trembling. The young man leaned over his grandfather's shoulder. The diary lay open to a detailed drawing of the rose window, not broken as it was now, but complete with the missing fragment in place. Latin annotations and astronomical symbols filled the margins. It says he didn't break it, Gabriel translated, after years of studying Latin for ecclesiastical documents. He carefully removed that fragment because it acts as a lens that allows one to see what is normally hidden. Eduardo turned toward the rose window. The light filtering through it projected a colorful pattern on the church floor, a pattern that, to his amazement, shifted slowly, following the movement of the sun. But that's not the most disturbing part, Gabriel continued, flipping through more pages. The last entries of Father Sebastián speak of a discovery he made beneath the altar. Not a treasure, as people believed, but something much older. An object he describes as predating the arrival of man to these lands. The old man looked up from the diary, fixing Eduardo with a grave stare. He also writes of a necessary sacrifice, the blood of the innocent, to seal what should never have been opened. A shiver ran down Eduardo's spine. Suddenly, the church seemed far colder and darker. Grandfather, he said, trying to steady his voice, this is just the ravings of a disturbed man. He probably lost his mind, murdered the poor woman, and ran away. There's no supernatural mystery here. But Gabriel did not answer. His eyes were fixed on something behind Eduardo. Slowly, the young man turned, every hair on his body standing on end. There, on the wall opposite the rose window, where the colored light projected its moving pattern, a shadow had appeared. The silhouette of a tall, thin man, dressed like a priest in a cassock. Yet there was no one present who could be casting that shadow. As they stared in horror, the shadow raised its arms in a gesture eerily reminiscent of Christ on the cross. And then, from the very walls themselves, the chant began. The same chant Gabriel had heard in his nightmares for decades. "We have to leave," Eduardo whispered, clutching his grandfather's arm. "Now!" But Gabriel did not move. His eyes were fixed on a page of the diary Eduardo hadn't yet seen, a drawing of a face. Not a human face, but one with eyes set too far apart, unnaturally large, and a mouth stretching from ear to ear in an impossible grin. "It's too late," the old man murmured in a voice that suddenly sounded decades younger. "He is here." At that moment, the colored light from the rose window completed its path, forming a perfect circle on the church floor. In the center of that circle, the ground began to sink as though something unseen was burrowing up from beneath. Eduardo dragged his grandfather toward the exit as the floor collapsed into a perfectly shaped pit. The chant from the walls grew louder and louder, until it reached a pitch almost unbearable to human ears. "The diary," Gabriel cried, struggling against his grandson's grip. "We cannot leave it behind." But Eduardo refused to let go. With one final effort, He pulled the old man outside, just as a thunderous roar shook the building. The church doors slammed shut behind them with hurricane force. Outside, the sky had darkened, not with storm clouds, but with the same unnatural fog that now engulfed the entire hill. The two men stumbled down the slope, slipping on the wet grass, never daring to look back until they reached the iron fence. Only then did they turn. What they saw stole their breath. The bell tower, untouched for a century of abandonment, was slowly collapsing, not with the violence of destruction, but as if the stone itself were dissolving. Whatever Father Sebastián found and sealed, it is waking up, Gabriel whispered, his gaze lost. And we have broken the seal. That night, an emergency meeting was held in Gabriel's house. Eduardo had summoned the few people in Veracruz who might have useful knowledge of what they had witnessed. Present were Father Tomas, the current parish priest, young but well-versed in ecclesiastical history, Dona Carmela, a 92-year-old woman, the last living person who had personally known Dona Mercedes, and Professor Alejandro Mendez, a local historian obsessed with the region's pre-Hispanic legends. Eduardo, still visibly shaken, began. What we saw today has no rational explanation, but before you dismiss it as the hallucinations of an impressionable youth and an old man, I want you to see this. He placed several objects on the table, the vial of blackened soil and the rosary with its dark beads. He also showed them 3 photographs he had managed to take inside the church, including one of the strange pattern of light cast by the rose window. Father Tomas examined the rosary with a grave expression. "These are not wooden beads," he finally said. "They are human bones, small fragments of phalanges, to be exact." A chilling silence filled the room. It was Professor Mendez who broke it. Adjusting his glasses, he explained. The ancient inhabitants of this region believed in beings who visited Earth from stars, beings they called those who watch from the sky. According to their traditions, such entities could not physically manifest in our world unless summoned through a specific ritual that required human sacrifice. And you believe Father Sebastián performed such a ritual? Eduardo asked, skeptical. Not necessarily, the professor replied. But perhaps he uncovered evidence that it had been done before, possibly on the very spot where the church was later built. It would not be the first time the Spaniards erected Christian temples on top of indigenous sacred sites. Gabriel, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. In the diary, Father Sebastián mentioned an object older than mankind, something he found beneath the altar and chose to seal away with a sacrifice. You're suggesting the priest deliberately killed Dona Mercedes? Father Tomas interrupted, horrified. I don't know, Gabriel admitted. The last pages of the diary were confusing, written like the ramblings of a man losing his sanity. He spoke of voices whispering from the walls, visions of a world beyond ours, and he repeated a phrase over and over. The stained glass is a window, but it can also be a door. Dona Carmela, who had been silent until then, let out a strangled sound. Everyone turned to her. My mother told me what people really said about Dona Mercedes' death, she said in a trembling voice. She was not found beneath the altar. She was embedded in the wall behind it, as if pushed through solid stone. A cold shiver ran down Eduardo's spine, remembering how the church walls had seemed to define normal dimensions. And there's more, the old woman continued. The authorities never made it public, but Dona Mercedes was 7 months pregnant when she died. And according to my mother, there was no trace of the baby. At this revelation, horror swept through the room. Just then, a sudden noise broke the silence. All the bells in the city began to ring simultaneously, though it was midnight. And among the cacophony, one tone rose above the rest, deeper, heavier, the bell of San Joaquín, which had not tolled in 100 years. When they rushed to the balcony, they saw the fog descending from the hill into the streets of Veracruz. And within the mist, dark figures moved toward the church. They're people, Eduardo whispered, squinting. Dozens of them, walking like sleepwalkers. Professor Mendez hurriedly pulled a small book from his pocket and flipped through its pages in a frenzy. Here it is, he said at last. The constellation we spoke of. The natives called it the Eye of the Watcher. It appears in our sky once every 100 years, and only for a few hours. According to legend, it is the one moment when the barrier between our world and theirs grows thin enough to allow passage. Passage? Eduardo asked, though he dreaded the answer. In both directions, the professor replied, his voice cracking with fear. They can enter, and we, or some of us, can be taken. At that, Don Gabriel went to an old trunk and retrieved an object wrapped in cloth. Unveiling it, he revealed an ancient double-barreled shotgun. I don't know what effect weapons will have on whatever is awakening in that church, he said, loading it. But I won't sit here waiting to find out. Father Tomas rose to his feet as well, determination in his eyes. Faith is also a weapon. Don Gabriel, perhaps a more powerful one. Eduardo watched the scene in disbelief. Part of him, the rational side, trained in university, still clung to the hope of a logical explanation. Perhaps toxic gas leaking from the crypt, causing mass hallucinations. Or maybe the entire city was falling victim to collective suggestion, fueled by a century of superstition. But as he looked out and saw the figures moving through the fog, all in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single mind, his skepticism wavered. The diary, he said suddenly. If Father Sebastián sealed something, he must have written down how to seal it again. The diary is still in the church, his grandfather reminded him. We left it behind when we fled. Then we'll have to go back for it, Eduardo declared, surprising even himself with his resolve. Before leaving, they studied one of the photographs Eduardo had taken of the light pattern from the rose window. Professor Mendez pointed to something none of them had noticed before. In the very center of the luminous circle, where the floor had begun to collapse, there appeared a shape. A face, human-like, yet distorted, disturbingly similar to the one Don Gabriel had seen sketched in the diary. There's one more thing you should know, the professor said gravely. According to the legends, these beings cannot manifest physically in our world on their own. They need vessels. Vessels? Eduardo asked. Human bodies, the professor clarified, and they prefer those not yet born. The implications of this statement, coupled with the revelation about Dona Mercedes' pregnancy, were too horrifying to speak aloud. Yet all of them thought the same thing. If Father Sebastián had performed a ritual using the unborn child of the cleaning woman as a vessel, what kind of creature had been growing, trapped beneath the altar of San Joaquín for a century? With this terrifying possibility in mind, the four men armed themselves with what they had: Gabriel's shotgun, Father Tomas's silver cross, the professor's notes, and Eduardo's modern lantern. Together, they prepared to face the horror awakening on the hill. Meanwhile, throughout the city, more and more people joined the silent procession ascending toward the church. Their eyes were open but vacant, their lips moving in a soundless chant. Among them were the elderly, adults, and even children, all drawn by a call only they could hear. Stepping into the street, the group had to hide several times to avoid being seen by the sleepwalkers. At one point, a girl no older than 8 passed, so close they could see her eyes. Her pupils were so dilated the iris was barely visible, and thin tears of blood streamed down her cheeks. She is suffering, Father Tomas whispered. They all are. When they finally reached the foot of the hill, the sight before them took their breath away. The church, which earlier that day had been crumbling, now appeared fully restored. More than that, it was larger and more majestic than ever, with architecture that defied logic. Impossible arches, angles that could not exist in three-dimensional space, and a bell tower towering far higher than they remembered. And at the top, where the rose window should have been, there was now a vast circular void spilling forth an unnatural green light. The church doors stood wide open, and toward them the procession of sleepwalkers advanced. Each time one of them crossed the threshold, the bells gave a single, deep toll. Eduardo, his heart pounding, turned to his companions and whispered his plan. We must enter before all those innocents are inside. If the diary is still where we left it, it may hold the key to stopping this. Don Gabriel nodded, gripping the shotgun tightly. And if we fail, he began. Then may God have mercy on our souls, Father Tomas finished, kissing the cross at his neck. With determination born less of courage than of desperation, the four men began to climb the hill, toward what seemed to be the very gates of hell. The interior of the church no longer resembled the abandoned ruin they had visited earlier that morning. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow rhythm, like the pulse of a colossal heart. The floor was slick with a viscous substance that shimmered faintly with a sickly green phosphorescence. The air itself was charged with so much static electricity that the hair on their arms stood painfully on end. The sleepwalkers had spread across the nave, arranging themselves into a perfect circle around the pit that had opened in the center of the church. The hole was now far wider and deeper than before, and from its depth spilled that same unnatural green light. At the altar, where earlier that day the iron chest had been hidden beneath the trapdoor, now stood a figure that froze the breath in their lungs. At first glance, it looked like a man in a white cassock, but a closer look revealed the truth. It was no man. Its proportions were subtly wrong. The arms, far too long. The torso, unnaturally thin. The head, too large for such a fragile body. And where a face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, gleaming surface, like a mirror in which each of them saw reflected their own worst fear. Father Sebastián, Don Gabriel whispered, his voice trembling. Or what remains of him? The creature slowly turned its faceless head toward them, as though it had only now noticed their presence. And though it had no eyes, every one of them felt the piercing weight of its gaze. That is not Father Sebastián, Professor Mendez said in a thin, trembling voice. It is what used his body as a vessel, and now it needs more, many more. As if confirming his words, the creature extended its grotesquely long arms and began to speak. The voice did not come from where its mouth should have been. Instead, it emerged from the very walls of the church, from the unmoving lips of the sleepwalkers, and even from within their own minds. "My children," it said, in archaic but perfectly clear Spanish, "you have come to witness the return. At last, after a full cycle, the alignment is perfect. The door is open, and my brothers may cross." Eduardo seized the moment. While the creature's attention remained fixed on the others, he slipped into the shadows, desperately searching for the diary they had dropped during their escape. His lantern beam caught a glimpse of it, lying near the altar, only a few feet from the thing that had once been Sebastián. Meanwhile, Father Tomas stepped forward, holding his silver cross high. "In the name of Almighty God," he proclaimed with a steady voice that belied his fear, "I command you, release these people and return to the hell from which you came." The creature made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like bones grinding and snapping beneath unbearable weight. "God," it answered, "your God is young. We existed before your first ancestors crawled from the sea, before there were stars in your sky. And we shall exist long after your kind is but a forgotten chapter in this world's history." With a slow, deliberate motion of its elongated hand, the cross in Father Tomas's grip began to soften, melting like wax in fire. He cried out in pain and dropped it, clutching his burned hand. That was the moment Don Gabriel raised his shotgun and fired. The blast roared through the nave, deafening in the enclosed space. The shot struck the creature squarely in the center of its mirrored face, staggering it backward. For an instant, just an instant, all held their breath. Then, with a sickening sound like cracking glass, the reflective surface splintered apart. Behind it was not flesh, not bone, but nothing. A void, an absolute blackness so profound it seemed to devour the light around it. The creature hissed, pointing one impossibly long, jointed finger at Don Gabriel. "You have interfered twice. 50 years ago, when you found the key you should never have touched. And today, when you broke the seal." Don Gabriel's face went pale. His voice trembled. How do you know about the key?" "Because I showed it to you," the creature replied. "In your dreams. I have called you since you were a boy, Gabriel Montero, ever since the man you called Sebastián Aguirre tried and failed to stop me." The revelation struck the old man like a physical blow. He staggered back, as though some invisible hand had struck him in the chest. Professor Mendez, forcing himself to remain calm, spoke quickly, trying to buy Eduardo more time as he crept closer to the diary. Father Sebastián tried to stop you, didn't he? The professor asked. His voice wavered, but carried a note of defiance. The faceless creature tilted its head with an almost curious gesture, its movements too smooth, too fluid, like joints bending in ways human bones never could. The priest discovered the truth too late, it said, its words vibrating through the walls and inside their skulls. He uncovered the artifact my worshippers had buried centuries before your conquerors came. An anchor for the portal. He sought to seal it with innocent blood, the blood of the woman and her unborn child. A sacrifice strong enough to bind me for a full cycle, but never enough to destroy me. As it spoke, the pit at the center of the church answered with dreadful noises. Faint cries echoing from unfathomable depths, wails in an unknown tongue, and beneath them all, the slow, thunderous beat of colossal wings. And Sebastián, Don Gabriel forced himself to ask, desperate to keep the creature's focus away from his grandson. What became of him? The thing's faceless head cocked again, as if amused. He offered himself as my first vessel, it replied. A bargain, his body in exchange for the knowledge he so craved. Fool, he thought he could contain me, command me from within. He never understood that I was not entering his world. He was entering mine. The words made Don Gabriel shudder to his core. Professor Mendez instinctively took a step back, clutching his chest. Meanwhile, Eduardo, crouched in the shadows, finally reached the fallen diary. He opened it with trembling hands and began to turn the pages desperately. His eyes widened when he found it. A drawing of the same sigil carved into Dona Mercedes's forehead the day she died. Beneath it, written in Sebastián's cramped Latin script, was a note. The reverse seal must be drawn with the blood of the one who opened the door. Eduardo froze, his throat tightening. His gaze lifted to Don Gabriel. It was his grandfather who had opened the iron box. His grandfather who had turned the key. It was his blood the ritual required. Before Eduardo could speak, the creature turned toward him in a blur of impossible speed. Knowledge will not save you, young architect. It hissed, somehow knowing his profession, though none of them had spoken it aloud. No more than it saved Sebastián. With a flick of its elongated hand, fire burst across the diary's pages. The book ignited in Eduardo's grip. He cried out, dropping it, but not before he had seen enough. The pit erupted in a blinding surge of green light. Something vast was rising, an enormity with countless limbs thrashing like monstrous tentacles. Around the circle, the sleepwalkers began to chant in unison, their mouths uttering words no human throat should have been able to form. The air quivered as the church itself seemed ready to rip apart. Now, Eduardo shouted to his grandfather, "Your blood is the only way." Don Gabriel looked at his grandson, and in that single glance, comprehension dawned. There was no hesitation. He bent down, grabbed a jagged shard of colored glass from the shattered rose window, and sliced it deep across his palm. The faceless creature roared, a sound so violent it shattered the remaining stained glass windows into raining shards. It lunged toward Don Gabriel, but Professor Mendez, with a cry, hurled himself in the monster's path. The thing struck him aside effortlessly, flinging his body against a column with such force that the snap of breaking bones echoed through the nave. Still bleeding heavily, Don Gabriel stumbled forward toward the pit. The sleepwalkers tried to block his path, but Father Tomas forced his way through them, reciting Latin prayers in a booming voice that seemed to confuse and paralyze them just long enough. Eduardo shouted instructions, recalling the sigil he had glimpsed in the diary. With shaking hand, Don Gabriel knelt at the pit's edge and began to trace the intricate pattern onto the floor in his own blood. The creature shrieked in fury, its scream tearing at the very fabric of reality. The church walls rippled like water, as though the building itself were about to collapse into another dimension. Don Gabriel finished the last line of the sigil. just as the faceless being loomed above him. A brilliant flash of white light exploded outward, blinding them all. When Eduardo's vision cleared, the scene before him had changed utterly. The pit in the center of the church was collapsing inward, pulling everything with it like a monstrous whirlpool. The faceless creature clung to the edge with its grotesquely long fingers, shrieking in defiance as the seal pulled it down. The sound was not merely noise, it tore at the soul. A final curse screamed across dimensions. The sleepwalkers lay scattered across the floor, unconscious but alive. Their lips, at last, were silent. At the brink of the abyss, Don Gabriel stood swaying, pale and drenched in blood, but still holding fast. He stared into the void, into the horror that writhed within. One cycle, he said, his voice not entirely his own, carrying an eerie resonance. I give you one more cycle of captivity, and when you awaken again, another guardian will be waiting. The creature's howl shook the church to its foundations. For a final moment, its faceless head turned upward, as if memorizing its enemies. Then the seal completed, and with a thunderous crash, the pit closed, leaving behind only a scorched circle etched into the stone floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Don Gabriel collapsed. Eduardo rushed forward, catching his grandfather before he struck the ground. The old man's skin was ashen, almost translucent, as if the blood he had spilled carried away part of his very soul. "Grandfather," Eduardo whispered, tears streaming down his face. "What have you done?" Don Gabriel managed a faint smile. "The same thing Sebastián did," he breathed. "An exchange. My life for a century of peace. A fair bargain, don't you think?" He coughed, a thin ribbon of blood running from the corner of his mouth. With trembling hand, he pressed something into Eduardo's palm. "The diary," he whispered. "It's not completely lost. Some pages survived. Find them, guard them, prepare the one who comes after you. For in 100 years, when the constellation aligns again, it will return." Eduardo's sobs broke the heavy silence. "What was it, grandfather? What was that thing?" Don Gabriel's eyes lifted weakly toward the shattered rose window, where the stars glimmered coldly above the night sky. "Something we should never have called," he murmured. "Something older than us, that will outlast us. Something that looks at our world as we look at an anthill, with distant curiosity and occasional cruelty." Those were his last words. Don Gabriel Montero died in the arms of his grandson. Outside, the unnatural fog began to dissolve. The first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, washing over Veracruz with the fragile promise of another day. 3 days after the events at San Joaquín, Eduardo Montero watched from a distance as workers sealed the church's entrance with massive iron plates. By order of the federal government, and with the Vatican's blessing, the building was condemned as unsafe and closed indefinitely. The official explanation was simple. A pocket of natural gas beneath the hill had leaked into the church, causing widespread hallucinations among the citizens of Veracruz. The deaths of Don Gabriel and Professor Mendez were attributed to an unfortunate accident during their investigation of the site. No one questioned the report. Those who had been part of the midnight procession remembered nothing. At most, they retained vague feelings of dread or recurring nightmares that faded with time. Father Tomas survived with only minor injuries. Within weeks, he was abruptly transferred to a parish in Spain. Before leaving, he gave Eduardo a small metal box. The surviving pages of the diary, he explained gravely. "I have informed my superiors, and they theirs. They know what happened, or at least enough. But this knowledge must remain hidden." Eduardo nodded. He understood. What good would it do to reveal the existence of such beings? It would only spread panic, or worse, tempt others to seek contact, as Father Sebastián had once done. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Eduardo asked, holding the box. "Guard it, study it, and when the time comes, pass it to the one who must continue the vigil," the priest replied. "Your grandfather sealed the door for another cycle. But in May of 2004, the constellation will align again. Someone must be ready. And if I can't find anyone," Eduardo asked softly, "you will, Father Tomas said, with absolute certainty, the guardian always appears, one way or another. With those enigmatic words, the young priest departed, leaving Eduardo alone with a terrible responsibility. In the years that followed, Eduardo devoted his life to the surviving fragments of Sebastián's diary and to studying every scrap of lore he could find about the ancient beliefs of Veracruz's pre-Columbian peoples. He discovered that the entity they had faced was known by many names in many cultures: the Whisperer among the stars, the Devourer of dreams, the Lord of the Outer Dark. He also learned that the Catholic Church had known far more about such beings than it ever admitted publicly. Hidden deep in Vatican archives were records of at least 7 similar cases around the world. Temples, mosques, and shrines built upon thin places in reality. Their rituals meant not for worship, but containment. Meanwhile, the Church of San Joaquín decayed again on its lonely hill. The jungle reclaimed its stones, and the iron plates rusted beneath climbing vines. The townsfolk avoided the place. Tourists never lingered. Yet once a year, on the night of May 17th, Eduardo climbed the hill alone and kept vigil until dawn, listening for any echo of that chant. Sometimes in the darkest hours before sunrise, he thought he heard it, faint, muffled, as if the walls themselves still remembered. Years passed. Eduardo married. He had a daughter. Her name was Maria. When she was 7, she began to speak in her sleep, in a language no one recognized. And at 12, she told her father about the faceless man who came to her dreams, promising wonders if she helped him return home. Eduardo understood then. The next guardian had already been chosen. The cycle, as with all things ancient and powerful, could never truly be broken, only delayed. And so the burden passed once more from one generation to the next.